So today we're looking at stacked bar graphs. Stacked bar graphs are a little bit different from regular bar graphs because you've got multiple pieces of information in a row, in a stack. So the reason they do this is because very often a stacked bar graph shows parts of a whole. So where you've got here percent of total US population 65 and over, you're given the total percentage along the very top. So it ranges from 4.1% in 1900 over to 12.4% in 2000. And then the legend tells us that this information is then divided into 3 age groups, 65 to 74, which is the red group along the bottom, 75 to 84, which is the orange group in the middle, and the black group, which is 85 and over. Okay. So this is the total percentage. Let's look at 2000. You've got 12.4% of the population were 65 and over in the year 2000. And that 12.4% is simply broken down into 3 categories, and the 6.5, 4.4, and 1.5 add up to 12.4. Now, there's generally 3 elements that cause confusion in this kind of bar graph. Very often people neglect to mention the totals. They just forget them. So you really have to look very carefully at every aspect of the graph. The totals also make for a great comparison between the breakdown and the total. But we'll go into that a little bit later. But this is important because we don't want to just describe the graph. We have to make some kind of meaningful comparisons. Okay, so we'll go into that in just a bit. And then also, line widths can be misleading. This is a major source of confusion when you just take a quick look at the graph. So if you look here at the end, it looks like this black group here has gone down. It also looks like the orange group has gone down in the final year because these lines are tending in the downward direction. However, the 85-plus-year-old group actually increased in the final year, as did the 75 to 84-year-old group. So again, you have to look at the numbers, not just the shape, because the shape, the pattern in the graph, the coloring can actually, you won't get a color one, but this kind of pattern can mislead you a bit. And the final source of confusion that I see, not just in this one, but in a lot of different graphs like this, is percentage versus percentage point difference. So someone might say something like, the proportion of seniors increased 8.3% during the period of the study. Okay, so it went from 4.1% over to 12.4%. So that's 12.4 minus 4.1, 8.3%. But it didn't. The percentage of seniors as a proportion of the population actually doubled and tripled in that time, from 4.1 to 12.4%. 12.4 minus 4.1 to get 8.3%, this is called percentage point. So the percentage of seniors increased by 8.3 percentage points, not percent. Yeah, it's an important distinction. If you listen to the financial news, they use this kind of language all the time when they say the stock market has increased by X number of points. Like, let's say it went up by 50 points. It's not 50%, it's 50 points. In this way too, if you're just taking the raw difference between percentages, that's a percentage point increase. And we'll go into that later as well. Okay, so what do you talk about when you see this kind of graph? And we sometimes call this the salient features of the graph, what's important and what's not. So first, let's talk about grouping the information. Our groups are going to become our body paragraphs. Okay, so how can we group this information logically? Any suggestions?
You can group by age.
Yep, by age is definitely the easiest way to do this. And what about the totals? The total numbers at the very top. I would include these as part of the first body paragraph together with the largest group. So if I were to do this, I would do the totals plus the 65 to 70-year-olds. It generally makes sense to start with the largest group, regardless of which kind of graph you're doing. Everyone is always interested in who's the biggest, who's the fastest, who makes the most money. So start with the largest group. Okay, so after the intro, body paragraph 1, I suggest you do total plus the largest group. Logically, body paragraph 2 would be the second largest group, the 75 to 84-year-olds, and then body paragraph 3 would be the third largest group, the 85-plus-year-olds. Okay. Next thing we want to consider is what verb tense do we need to use for this kind of description. Other than the basic description of the graph saying the graph shows, or we can see in the graph, or it can be seen in the graph, that's present simple, but everything else is going to be past tense, past simple, because the graph, the study finished in the year 2000. Everything is going to be past simple, so you don't need to worry too much about verb tenses. We want to start by looking at the overall trend. Information generally goes from general down to specific. So we start with the most general information. So the overall trend here, what is the percentage of the US population of seniors over the period? So we already mentioned this. So it went from 4.1% to 12.4%. Okay. So this is 8.3 percentage point increase. And the percentage change over the period, you don't need to take out a calculator and calculate it perfectly, but it increased by, let's say if something doubles, it goes from 4 to 8, that is a 100% increase. If something goes from 4 to 8 and then from 8 to 12, that is a 200% increase. Just over 200%. You want to use some language like just over, approximately, roughly, slightly more than, because it's not precise, and you don't need to be super precise because you don't have a calculator. Okay. So it's just over 200%. It went from 4.1 to 12.4% of the population. Okay, and now let's look at the overall trend for each item. So we'll look for the highest and the lowest values. We'll look at percentage change, and we'll look at some kind of relationships that often come up. Okay, so I'm going to call this one versus many relationships. So let's look at the overall trend for each item. And the reason you want to do this is smallest items often show the greatest percentage change versus large items, which often show the largest absolute values. Now, what does that mean? It means that when you've got an item, in this case, let's say 65 to 74-year-olds, among these three groups, this one has the largest starting number. Generally, items, whether they're products or population groups that start with the largest number and end with the largest number, they don't have the largest percentage change because they're not starting from zero. Whereas this group of 85-plus-year-olds, for example, they're starting at a very small number, 0.2% of the population. So even very small changes will result in a very large percentage change increase. Okay. Even something like this, you see it's stable at 0.2% of the population, then it goes to 0.3% of the population. Just using this as an example, what percentage difference is this increase from 0.2 to 0.3%? Yes, that's a 50% increase from 0.2 to 0.3. For the entire period, it's going from 0.2 to 1.5, whereas the 65 to 74-year-old group is going from 2.9 to 6.5. Okay, so let's do some quick rough calculations. So the 65 to 74-year-old group, what was their percentage of the population over the period? So it went from 2.9 to 6.5. What percentage change would that be roughly?
650.
from 2.9 to 6.5.
600. Roughly 700.
More than double.
It more than doubled. Round this to 3, and this is 6.5. So if something costs $3, and then you go back the next day and it's $6.5, it's slightly more than doubled. Right. So over 100% increase. 100% increase and doubling means the same thing. Now, here's an interesting thing, an interesting relationship that might be worth mentioning. What's the relationship between the number of 65 to 74-year-olds and the number of seniors in the other two age groups? The proportion of seniors in the red group is always more than the combined total of the other two groups.
Okay.
So if we see here in the final year, 4.4 and 1.5 adds up to 5.9, it's still less than 6.5. If we look at the first year, the two oldest groups add up to 1.2, and it's significantly lower than 2.9. Right. So that's kind of where the trend has been going. And that's an observation that you can describe. So here, always more than combination of other two groups. That's just an observation. Okay, 75 to 84-year-olds. What percentage of the population were they over the period of the study? 1 to 4.4%. So what percentage change was this?
$300.
Yeah, over 300%.
Over 300.
1 to 2 is 100%. 1 to 3, 200%. 1 to 4, 300%. And then finally, 85-year-olds. So 85-year-olds went from 0.2 to 1.5% of the US population. What was the percentage change over this period?
650.
Yes, 650%. Right, so you see here, and this is a very typical pattern to look out for, that you've got the biggest increase in absolute terms. So in absolute terms, it's a 3.6 percentage point increase. Okay. Percentage point increase. This one here, you've got a 3.4 percentage point increase. And here, notice it just keeps dropping as you get to the lower ones. But you always see this kind of reverse relationship where whether it's the population group or a product or a budget item that starts off at the lowest amount, any kind of growth leads to a very high percentage increase. So we've got 3.6, 3.4, descending down to 1.3, but then the percentage increases are over 100%, over 300%, and 650%. So that's worth mentioning. Okay. Now let's look at our list and see if there are any other patterns. Are there any pattern reversals? So something that's going up falls, or something that's falling is going up? Yes, at the very end. Okay. In terms of the total number, or total proportion rather, of senior citizens in the United States went from 12.6 to 12.4, and also the percentage of 65 to 74-year-olds also dropped at the very end. So you've got those reversals. The other patterns, same at beginning and end. We don't see that. Rank changes, we don't see any. Outliers, nope. Peaks and troughs, not really. You've got this peak here at 12.6, but we don't have any like up and down patterns, so that's not really relevant either. Okay, so this is the major pattern that we're looking at. Okay, now let's get into how we write about this. So in terms of our structure, we need an intro paragraph that includes two parts. First part is the context. The context is what are we talking about? And you get that simply from the graph description that IELTS gives you. So paraphrase this bit. And then you can also look for additional information on the y-axis, on the x-axis, for example, the time period here. But that's already in the title. You can provide information from the legend. This bit down here is called a legend, so you can mention the different demographic segments that were included in the study. And also we've got the source, the US Census Bureau. So those are all things that you can mention in the context. And then after the context comes the overview, the general overview, and it's got to have a fine balance between being too general versus being too specific. Try and do it without any data if possible. Okay. So let's start with a little bit of writing, and let's do the context, the very first sentence. One strategy that I advise for this exam, if you're taking the exam, is just chunk the description that they give you and just paraphrase it piece by piece. So in this case, our sentence is, the chart below shows the percentage of total US population age 65 and over between 1900 and 2000. So the structure of this sentence is subject, the chart, and we're going to ignore below. Don't ever talk about it being below. So we've got the chart as our subject, shows as our verb, object, the percentage of total US population aged 65 and over, and then between 1900 and 2000 is our preposition phrase at the end. Okay. So we can just paraphrase this chunk by chunk. And let's see what happens. I'll give you, let's say 1 minute, 2 minutes to paraphrase this one sentence and just pop your response into the chat. Let's make a composite. Maybe that'll help us. So this first one here is the original. Let's take it piece by piece. So from the first one, let's keep the graph illustrates. The chart shows, the graph illustrates. Now, the percentage of total US population aged 65 and over. What's a synonym for the percentage?
Portion.
The portion or proportion. The percentage of total US population age 65 and over. A good synonym for total US population would be
Americans.
good. Americans.
Maybe divided.
Of Americans 65 and over. Divided into 3, let's write it out, 3 age groups. And we can write 65 to 74, 75 to 84, and 85 plus. And I'm going to switch this to brackets. And then it says between 1900 and 2000. How would you paraphrase that? Between 1900 and 2000.
Maybe starting from
Why not just from? 1000. And who wrote the study?
according
To
course.
U.S. Census Bureau, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. Okay, this is a thorough introduction. This is a very thorough description of what we're talking about. Okay. It has all the parts, and I've done my best to keep the same structure as the original because it just works out that way. It makes life a little bit easier for us. Next step, we need our general overview. So that's going to be the next sentence. What do we want to tell the reader is the big pattern that this graph reveals?
The senior population is growing, was growing.
Mm-hmm.
And total, we need to mention total amount.
Yes. So if this graph only had this very top total percentage, then what you said is enough. But it has all this other information too. Now, we have to be very selective about what we include in the general overview. We don't need to include all of it. But what can we say is generally true about this pattern? So yes, the total senior population grew steadily for most of the studied period, except the very last period. So we want to try and do this without reference to numbers. The reason you want to do it without reference to numbers is because then it becomes a bit repetitive. And also, you won't have as much to talk about if you mention numbers ahead of time. And also the other reason is it confuses the reader. You want to try and paint a picture without reference to numbers if possible. Total population increased. What else happened? What else was true? Remember these percentages we talked about?
Triple.
Right. What's the general pattern here? If you had to describe this without numbers.
Every age group increased the
Yes. And which groups increased the most as a percentage?
by 85 plus.
Which group was in second place in terms of percentage?
75.
84. Yeah,
What?
and then 75 to 84. And then the third biggest increase in terms of percentage was the largest group, 65 to 74. So how would you package that into one brief statement? Do you see that? Do you see that opposite relationship? All the groups increased, right? Which groups increased the most as a percentage?
The oldest one.
Yes. So as a percentage, the 75 to 84-year-olds increased more than the 65 to 74-year-olds, and then the 85 plus year olds, this group increased the most as a percentage. That's what I would include in my general overview. Total population of elderly, percentage of population increased. Okay, I will leave you with those 3 facts to write your general overview now. Okay. Try and do it in 1 sentence, if possible. Okay, I'll give you maybe 3-4 minutes to write this one. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay, so let's get to the body paragraphs. So we know what we're going to put in the body paragraphs. I would start with general topic sentences. Just like with the general overview, if you can do general topic sentences that avoid data, it'll help you to increase word count, and it'll also improve cohesion. Because just like with the general overview, you're giving the reader a forecast of what's coming next. The same principle applies to individual body paragraphs. The first sentence, the topic sentence, should tell the reader what they can expect in that paragraph. So here are a couple model intro sentences. So for body paragraph 1, you can start with, in terms of the total population, the proportion of seniors grew steadily over most of the studied period. So no data, but it tells you exactly what's coming next. And then since we're combining the total numbers with the 65 to 74-year-old group, in that same paragraph, you're going to have a transition phrase among seniors. 65 to 74-year-olds comprised the largest proportion. And then you'll give the data, the supporting data, afterwards. For a high score, it's just representative of good writing. Everything you say, all your statements are then backed up with supporting data, right? And then at the very end here, you can mention the drop off at the very end. That overall went up, 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 but then in the final year dropped a little bit. Body paragraph 2, you can use this kind of intro sentence. A similar trend was seen with the next group. So let's say with 75 to 84-year-olds, and notice how I'm writing it down with the hyphens. Okay, and then you give the supporting data for 75 to 84-year-olds. And then in the final body paragraph, you can use this as kind of a template sentence for these kinds of situations. Finally, while the oldest age group made up the smallest proportion of the population, it showed the largest percentage increase. Okay. And you can swap out a product here, for example, or a budget item, right? And use this sentence as a template. Okay. And again, supporting data comes afterwards. And we've already talked about the supporting data, so you've got all that info. Okay, any questions about this one?